on this Friday night, the Prime Minister's closest advisor under oath. Katie Telford's testimony about alleged foreign interference.
When we receive intelligence briefings of any kind, we don't leave any stones unturned.
What happens next in the investigation? Fire and fury in France. The outrage over pension reforms and a top court's decision. A fresh approach to death care.
Our huge fear of talking about dying is killing us.
The new, greener way to bury loved ones. And no contact with the outside world, no showering, no problem. Why this woman spent 500 days in a cave alone.
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening to you, and thank you for joining us tonight. She's been described as Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's right hand. And today, Katie Telford, his top advisor, appeared in front of a parliamentary committee looking into foreign interference in Canadian elections. And it's been a long road to get her to speak. From months of calls from the opposition to get Telford to testify, to a Liberal filibuster to block her from appearing. That's why today, some were bracing for a bombshell back and forth, but that didn't happen.
I can't speak specifically to what was discussed in briefings over the course of those months. I can't get into, unfortunately, in this public setting, what was or wasn't briefed on. I can't, unfortunately, go further. As I've said before, I can't get into the specifics of what you're describing. I can't speak to this information, I can't speak to that information. I think, Madam Chair, you'll know my answer on this, which is that I can't speak to
Thank you.
Specifics.
Justin Trudeau's chief of staff repeatedly cited national security as to why she couldn't offer up those details on alleged Chinese meddling in Canada's last two elections. But in the more than 2 hours of testimony, Telford did offer some insight into the line of communication between herself and the Prime Minister. Mackenzie Gray begins our coverage tonight.
From the start of her testimony, Katie Telford made it clear she wouldn't be able to say much.
I will do my best to answer your questions. At the same time, I must respect the law.
That response became a common refrain from the Prime Minister's chief of staff.
Publicly disclosing what our intelligence agencies know or how they come to know it can irreparably harm Canada's national interests and put people's lives in danger.
But despite avoiding commenting on the contents of many allegations publicly, privately, Telford said no information would be held back.
There is nothing that is ever kept from the Prime Minister. Certainly not by me.
Much of that intelligence shared with the Prime Minister came from the National Security Advisor and the head of CSIS. Documents submitted to the committee show Trudeau was briefed by them 6 times between October 2018 and March of this year, and often was joined by Telford. But that number excludes informal briefings by security officials. And Telford didn't say if Trudeau read key documents from the Privy Council that have informed much of Global News' reporting on the topic.
I can't, unfortunately, speak to specifics of what the Prime Minister has or has not been briefed on in all of this.
Telford also said she couldn't comment on new interference allegations raised by the Conservatives in a suburban Toronto riding.
10 weeks before the 2021 election, Bob Soroya, the then Member of Parliament for Markham Unionville, received a cryptic and threatening text message from Beijing's Consul General in Toronto, suggesting that he would no longer be a Member of Parliament after the 2021 election.
And right now it's having
the NDP spent much of their time questioning Telford on why the Liberals haven't called a public inquiry into the issue.
So I'm just wondering, have you ever advised, through the chair, of course, the Prime Minister against launching a public inquiry? And if so, why?
It's not clear what the question should be. It's not clear what body is best to look at it, given the sensitive nature of the information.
The choice on what body is best to further study the alleged interference has been given by Trudeau to David Johnston, his special rapporteur on the issue. And Farah, Mr. Johnston has until May 23rd to come to a decision.
Mackenzie Gray in Ottawa. Thank you, Mackenzie. All right, for more on this and analysis, let's bring in our chief political correspondent, David Akin. David, when it comes down to it, Canadians want to know if any of their elections were compromised and what the Prime Minister knew when he was running for office. So did we get any further in answering those questions today?
Not really from today's testimony, Farah. You know, this whole issue of election interference has become such a highly charged issue that MPs really could not get beyond, you know, that partisan back and forth. The Conservatives believe the Liberals are covering up information that would show China worked to defeat Conservative candidates. The Liberals are indignant at those suggestions, and Telford herself today reminded the committee that Canada-China relations were, in fact, at their worst in decades during the last two elections. So why would China help the Liberals? Now, as for what the Prime Minister knew and when he knew it, Trudeau himself has admitted he got multiple briefings on election interference, but neither he nor Telford today can really provide the specifics. What exactly was he told? When was he told? About what situations? They say if they did that, they could be harming national security.
Okay, David, Telford's highly anticipated testimony is now in the book. So where do things go from here in this investigation into alleged foreign interference?
Well, there's plenty of work still to be done. What you saw today was the work of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, and they will continue their work. They're going to hear from witnesses next week, including from a former National Security Advisor to the PM, Daniel Jean. But there's also the House Ethics Committee. They are doing their own study. And there's yet another committee of parliamentarians that looks at security and intelligence issue. And this all-party group, well, they've got top secret security clearance, so they can look at classified materials, but they're sworn to secrecy, so they can't tell us about it. So, Farah, if we really want the answers to the questions you asked at the top of this segment, it looks like it's got to be a public inquiry, and that's just what all the opposition parties have been pushing for, what the NDP were talking about. And as Mackenzie reminded us, David Johnson's mission is to advise the PM whether or not to hold that inquiry. And Trudeau has said he's going to do whatever Johnson recommends. Now, privately, Liberal MPs are telling me they don't see how Johnson can avoid recommending that an independent inquiry ought to be held. Now the trick after that would be finding that perfectly neutral King Solomon-like figure to preside over such a commission, and perhaps even trickier, what sort of terms of reference would that inquiry have that would satisfy all parties? Tricky. Farah?
And who makes those terms of reference? David Akin in Ottawa, thank you. Former Ontario Progressive Conservative MPP Vincent Ke, who is now sitting as an independent, says he served Global News with a notice of libel in relation to allegations of election interference by China. On March 10th, Global News reported that according to intelligence sources, Ke served as a financial intermediary in Chinese Communist Party interference schemes. Ke denies the allegations and resigned from the Ontario Progressive Conservative caucus shortly after the report. The Ford government acknowledged it had been briefed by CSIS, and Premier Doug Ford says Ke will be allowed back into caucus if he is cleared. To Europe now. Key parts of France's unpopular plan to raise the retirement age has been approved, stoking rage that's simmered for months. Anger boiled over in Paris as demonstrators hit the streets in response. The Constitutional Council approved changing the retirement age from 62 to 64. President Emmanuel Macron says the population's aging and the change is needed to keep the pension system afloat. But as Crystal Goomansingh reports, it's triggered the country's worst social unrest in years.
Even before nightfall, riot police in the French capital scrambled to multiple locations trying to get a handle on demonstrations. The French Prime Minister said there are no winners or losers after pension reforms were determined to be legal. But there is anger.
What can I say? I'm shocked. We're living in a democracy, and it's not a democracy.
A climate of anger is what one group's sign read outside Paris City Hall. Macron, others chanted, Macron, get out. It's disgusting, says this pensioner. This will perpetuate the violence. Making good on an election pledge, Emmanuel Macron is pushing back the age for people to collect their full pensions from 62 to 64. The changes will be phased in starting in 2027, but the process to implement the reforms will get underway September 1st. The changes prompted weeks of national strikes and protests, some of which turned violent and destructive. On March 16th, the government used what opposition and trade unions call the nuclear option in the French constitution to push through the legislation. Article 49.3 allows the government to bypass a vote by MPs. The head of the General Confederation of Labor Unions says workers are united and are being called on to keep up the pressure with another massive demonstration planned for May 1st. Crystal Goomansingh, Global News, London.
The leaders of Brazil and China have pledged to bolster cooperation between the two nations as the pair met for widely anticipated talks in the Chinese capital today. Xi Jinping welcomed Luiz Lula da Silva with full military honors at the Great Hall of the People. Talks between the leaders are said to have largely focused on trade ties, with the pair overseeing the signing of agreements in 15 areas, ranging from agriculture to aeronautics. The meetings underscored the improved relations between the two nations since Lula took over from his predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro, in January. A major prisoner swap is underway in Yemen, a glimmer of hope in a devastating 8-year conflict. Up to 900 detainees could be exchanged over the next 3 days under the UN-brokered deal, but it's believed thousands are still being held in a conflict that's evolved from a civil war to a proxy war between Saudi-backed government forces and Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. The unrest has led to what the UN calls the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Tens of thousands of people have been killed and millions forced to rely on food aid to survive. The U.S. Supreme Court has temporarily lifted restrictions on a common drug used to terminate pregnancies. It means for now that the medication will stay widely available as a challenge moves ahead. Since the fall of Roe v. Wade last summer, abortion access has been under increasing attack in the United States. Today, Florida became the latest state to enact strict new limits on access to abortion. But as Jackson Prosco reports, Republican lawmakers are still pushing for a nationwide ban.
Late at night and with little fanfare, Florida's governor signed the restrictive new abortion bill into law.
70 yeas, 40 nays, Mr. Speaker.
After state legislators approved a ban on virtually all abortions after 6 weeks, before many know they're pregnant.
We stand for life. We stand with mothers.
It's a stunning move by a state with the highest abortion rate in the U.S. Demand for pregnancy terminations in Florida has soared by 60%. Since neighboring states have severely restricted access, following the Supreme Court's decision to overturn federal protections.
Essentially, this is kind of yet one more door closing on access to abortion in the American South.
Yet Republican lawmakers keep trying to go further. They're pushing for a national abortion ban. Idaho recently made it a felony to assist a minor in obtaining an out-of-state abortion. Texas is attempting to block websites that offer information about reproductive rights, while a Texas judge revoked regulatory approval for mifepristone, the most commonly used drug in medical abortions.
People that are going to be most impacted by not having access to these safe and legal pills are people who are low income. They are most likely rural, usually people of color.
Friday, the Supreme Court temporarily halted the Texas ruling. The court could make a formal ruling on access to mifepristone as early as next week.
We are going to continue to fight in the courts. We believe that the law is on our side and we will prevail.
Our choice! It's clear abortion will be a defining issue in the 2024 election. A majority of Americans support legal access.
I think the more the stakes are raised and the more the prospect of a nationwide criminal ban is on the table, the harder that's going to be for American voters.
That likely won't stop the race toward more restrictive measures as Republicans shift further to the extremes, putting reproductive rights on the line. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
In South Florida's flood zone for Lauderdale is still under a state of emergency tonight after Wednesday's record rainfall. The storm dropped more than 2 feet of rain over parts of the state in just 7 hours, turning roads and runways into rivers. And it completely shut down the city's international airport, which finally reopened today. There is a chance of even more rain tonight. A pork processing plant in Quebec is shutting down. Coming up, the consequences for one small community. To Quebec now, where the closing of a slaughterhouse south of Quebec City is set to cost the region close to 1,000 jobs. Meat producer Olimel announced it will shutter its pork plant in the town of Vallée-Jonction by the end of the year, a move it calls inevitable due to a labor shortage, inflation, and changing markets. Mike Armstrong looks into the latest casualty of this country's evolving economy.
The company says it doesn't have much of a choice. The factory is one of 4 Olimel uses to slaughter and process hogs, mostly for export. But that's gotten tougher. The Chinese market now produces for itself, and there's increased international competition.
We know it's a tough decision.
Olimel's president says the company processes about 105,000 pigs a week in 4 plants, and by the end of the year wants to cut that by about 20%.
We don't need 4 plants to do that. We only need 3, so that pretty much sums it up.
Closing the plant means laying off 984 people. It'll be a major blow not only to the town, but to the region. Vallée-Jonction's population is only about 2,000. The plant draws from a wide area. The mayor says each of the Olimel jobs means 3 spin-off jobs.
It's hard to replace these jobs.
Sylvain Charlebois is a food researcher and professor at Dalhousie University. The closure, he says, will hurt. But he says Olimel was overextended financially after recent takeovers and hadn't focused on modernizing.
I do believe that this is not over, where actually I think we're likely going to see another plant close.
Quebec's Farmers Union is calling on the province to protect the industry. Farmers, they say, are already suffering with inflation. Now the province's biggest agricultural export, pork, is seeing demand slashed. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Montreal.
Living under a rock, literally, ahead what drove this woman to spend hundreds of days in darkness. Western Australia is assessing the damage done by a Category 5 storm. Earlier today, tropical cyclone Ilsa slammed parts of the state with fierce winds and rain. Right before it hit the mainland, Ilsa reached wind speeds clocking 289 kilometers an hour, setting new wind records. The storm's path largely spared major population areas. There are no reports of any injuries. Ilsa is expected to continue to weaken as it moves inland. Europe's first ever mission to Jupiter is underway.
Allumage Vulcain. Allumage AP décollage.
The spacecraft, dubbed JUICE, blasted off from a rocket from French Guiana, and it's going to explore Jupiter and 3 of its ice-encrusted moons that are believed to have big liquid oceans beneath their exteriors. But you're going to have to be patient because the spacecraft is taking the long route and it won't reach Jupiter until 2031. And in Spain, an extreme athlete is finally seeing light after spending more than a year 70 meters underground. 50-year-old Beatriz Flamini emerged after 500 days living in a cave with no news from the outside world. She missed out on key events like the start of Russia's war in Ukraine and Queen Elizabeth's death. With the exception of spending 8 days right outside due to technical issues, her stay was all part of an experiment to see what the mind and body can endure. And if you're wondering what she did there during that time, well, she spent much of it making art, exercising, knitting, and reading books. Next, the eco-friendly alternative, replacing traditional burial methods. Whether you want to acknowledge it or not, dealing with death is big business, one that has been mainly focused on cremating, embalming, or burying. In Canada, cremation is one of the most popular options. None is great for the environment, but another greener option is gaining traction here. Here's Sophie Louis to explain. Sophie.
That's right, and that new option is human composting. In the U.S., some states have now legalized a method that takes a human body and turns it into soil. The first to do so was Washington State. So we went to Seattle and met Micah Truman, who feels strongly that our approach to death care needs to change.
Our huge fear of talking about dying is killing us. We are unable, because we cannot face it, to talk about reasonable, considered solutions that make sure that our last act on this planet is not to pollute it.
Truman is the founder of Return Home, a place where you can send your loved ones to be composted, or as he likes to say, terramated.
Just to explain the process to you, about yay high, a couple feet high, we place organics, alfalfa, straw, and sawdust.
Okay.
Above that, we place the body.
Yeah.
And above that, we place the remaining organics. So the body is essentially cocooned inside the organics.
And you don't have to add anything else? No chemicals, nothing like that?
Nothing. We add absolutely nothing.
And at the end of it, you're left with this vessel full of
soil.
Soil that is then given to loved ones who can use it as they like. After Claudia Mason lost her husband Rob in a hit and run last summer, she decided terramation was the right choice for him.
I knew immediately that he was going to be composted.
She chose it for environmental reasons, but what she also gained was the time to grieve. Human composting is not a quick process. It can take about 2 months.
I worried very much that when a family understood 60 days was the time, that it was unacceptable. And we have never had a single person ever have issue with 60 days ever. What we give back to our families allows them to put it in the earth and restart the cycle of life.
Terramation is not available in Canada yet, but experts in what's called the green burial movement say it is the future of death care and that it's only a matter of time before the option is open to us here. Farah?
Sophie Louie in Vancouver. Thank you, Sophie. To learn more about how human composting works and other emerging choices for green burials, watch Sophie's full report on the new reality tomorrow night at 7, right here on Global. And that's Global National for this Friday night. I'm Farah Nasser, and on behalf of our whole crew here, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your Friday evening with us. Tonight's Dear Canada is this Inukshuk in Bragg Creek, Alberta. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.